Shopify grows your business no matter how far or big you grow. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. Whether you're selling your fans' next favorite shirt or an exclusive piece of podcast merch, Shopify helps you sell everywhere. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the U.S. Allbirds, Rothy's, Brooklinen, and millions of other entrepreneurs of every size across 175 countries. Plus, Shopify's award-winning help is there to support your success every step of the way. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Sign up for a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income now to grow your business, no matter what stage you're in.
At Evernorth Health Services, we believe costs shouldn't get in the way of life-changing care, and we're doing everything in our power to make it possible. Behavioral health solutions that also keep your projections at their best? It's possible. Pharmacy benefits that benefit your bottom line? It's possible. Complex specialty care that cares about your ROI? It's possible. Because we're already doing it. All while saving businesses billions. That's Wonder made possible. Learn more at evernorth.com/wonder.
Croeso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode number 217, Rebecca and the Gates. We've spent a lot of time over the last 17 episodes talking a lot about social, religious, and political circumstances in the early 1800s because much of what happened in the 1840s in Wales was influenced by the confluence of these issues. It is important to understand that much of what we know about Wales in our current time period was initially something that came from this era of Wales. From the perceptions on language, culture, and how to react to government, and especially how independence was rekindled after many years, were kind of set or at least begun during this time period. Keep in mind, since the rise of the Tudors and the end of the Stuarts, Wales had largely emerged into the British fold. Some didn't see it as separate. Some wanted it even more immersed into the idea of Britain over Wales because it was to their advantage. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone everywhere were in agreement or that there were not conversations about what Wales would be like if it was on its own. To make that assumption would, of course, be wrong of me and certainly not one I want to try and present in this circumstances. However, as Britain's empire expanded, on the podcast, as I have pointed out previously, there were many who left seeking either ambitions, financial gain, or in some cases, freedom for what they perceived to be a bad situation for themselves. Those that stayed were either content with their positions and cultural familiarity or unable to take advantage of the new opportunities that might have been presented to them if they could afford it. However, as time went on and industrialization began to change population size and compilation, it also changed a lot of the stratification of class structures, and because of this, many became discontent about their own societal position. There were cracks, of course, now appearing in this British society. And as the cracks continued to fracture, it created new issues for the authorities. It was, of course, in the midst of labor strife and societal change that the Rebecca Riots protests swept through rural Wales in the early to mid-19th century. Between the First and Third Reform Acts, Welsh politics was generally dominated by the conflict between the Anglican and Anglicized landed aristocrats and gentry, and the middle class led by popular radical movements based around an agenda setting issue of descent and the problems of the countryside, including the relationships between the landlords or the gentry and the payments of church rates or taxes that were basically sent to the church, all of which came from the poor and middle class who had less vote, less say, and less control over the circumstance and situation. Even as these conflicts grew in poorer communities, these clashes were not always perceived positively. In reality, bickering amongst some church people was a matter which was a debate over who could graze on the trough of tax dollars and of the income of these hardworking people, rather than representing them or presenting some new gospel idea, certainly led to a lot of irritation and upset. Some writers in Wales began to see those who belonged to the dissenting clergy as among those who were, in quotes, turncoats, who prided themselves upon being bundled together with the aristocracy and copied their manners. Another point of annoyance was the appointment of English officials who, according to one writer, exultingly ignorant of the Welsh language. The widespread apathy to higher rates, rents, and tithes, as well as a growing awareness of the linguistic and religious division, provided laborers, tenant farmers, and the emergent professional and commercial classes with a common enemy in the form of landowners, clerics, and large farmers. To be blunt, these were flashpoints that created the Rebecca Riots, and frequently were areas that would create more and more clashes and class division. Rebecca would appear during these disputes between these landlords and tenants by calling for lower rents or opposing evictions and private enclosures of common land. So, why were they called the Rebecca Riots specifically? Well, the name comes from the biblical figure Rebecca, the wife of one of the early prophets, who took upon her own cause against the oppressor. In a society where reading the Bible was an everyday occurrence, it was common to see comparisons in life with the religious experience in the Bible. Framed with that, it inspired the concept of following biblical ideas as part of the best example you could show, and as literacy spread, these stories became more and more significant to the population. These riots, of course, were born out of frustration and anger at the economic injustices faced by rural poor and particularly farmers who were struggling under heavy taxation and unfair treatment by the landowners. To understand the Rebecca Riots, we need to step back to the social economic landscape of 19th century Wales. At this time, Wales was predominantly rural, as I mentioned before, with agriculture forming the backbone of its economy. However, many farmers found themselves in dire straits. They were burdened with higher taxes, tolls, and rents, which were imposed by both the government and wealthy landowners who had particularly large power and influence with the society. The riots were sparked by a convergence of factors, each contributing to the simmering discontent amongst the rural population. The primary grievance for many Welsh rural poor was the imposition of toll gates by turnpike trusts on major roads. These tolls, intended to fund road maintenance, placed an additional financial burden on an already impoverished rural populace who relied on these roads for the transportation of goods and livestock. Second was legislation like the Enclosure Acts, which facilitated the privatization of common land, depriving tenant farmers of vital grazing grounds and resources. This was an area which saw a major rise of both stately homes and large estates, as the money flowed in to the upper classes in amounts that had never been seen before in Britain, as the colonialization of the world was creating very, very wealthy landholders. These landowners began to seize common lands for their own benefit, further exasperating rural poverty and exasperating tensions between landlords and tenants. As you can imagine, if for the better part of 100 years you've been able to take your cattle up a grassy slope to feed them, and all of a sudden now you're being told you can't because it's owned by some lord of some type, it would be both exasperating and infuriating. Adding fuel to the fire was the debate about how little voice the poor and middle class had in the political circumstance. This lack of adequate representation in government meant that the grievances of the rural population went unheard, fueling resentment and anger. Something we've talked about quite a bit in this podcast is how much was driving efforts to reform the government and the policies of government in Britain at the time, and how they were being driven by this level of separation between power and accessibility to it. For many of these rural poor in southwest Wales, problems were being exacerbated during a succession of wet seasons, unproductive harvests, combined with a fall in the price of cattle and butter, all of which we've mentioned previously, to below the national average. When most of what you are selling is dropping in price while everything else you are buying is going up, it creates a ratcheting up of inflation in ways that are unsustainable. All of this had done much to reduce what little savings these tenant farmers had and could depend on to get them through the hard times. Faced with sharp drops in income, farmers found no relief in the expenditures required of them in the forms of rents, tithes, poor rates, and county rates, all of which either remained constant or increased over this period. So in other words, while your income is going down, the taxes required of you are going up or staying the same, neither which is sustainable. Around the time period of the riots, there was a sense of how bad things had become. An editorial in the Welshman described this growing sense of economic crisis caused by the price collapse of 1842 to 1843 and the persistence of higher rents. Quote, "Distress and ruin are progressing with giant strides all over the country. The manufacturers are stopping work because they cannot sell their goods, and their workmen are thrown upon the parishes and cease to buy food, clothing, and provisions which the farmers have to sell. This produces distress amongst the farmers, and besides a heavy burden, increases in their poor rates, and then as the farmers find they cannot dispose of their cattle, their corn, and other things, they will, by degrees, cease to produce them. Up will go the prices of the few of which of these the public is still able to buy, and then will come a flood of corn and cattle from foreign countries, which will put the finishing stroke to the farmer's misery unless his landlord will give up his rents, a thing not very likely to happen." End quote. All of this economic chaos was compounding the misery on top of misery for many of the poor, needy, and those that were bearing the greater weight of the tax structure in Wales.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Greetings from Evergreen Podcasts. We're rolling out a listener survey, and we want to hear from you. The information in the survey will help us gather statistics and in turn make our shows more appealing to advertisers. I know most people don't like ads, but this is one of the only ways our shows make money and help keep their lights on. We promise it will only take a few minutes, but the impact on our podcasts will be tremendous. As a token of our appreciation, we'll randomly select one lucky participant each month to win an exclusive merchandise package from Evergreen Podcasts. Head to evergreenpodcast.com/listener-survey to help a show and possibly get some free stuff for doing so. We can't thank you enough for the support. Now back to the show.
As mentioned in the last episode, Welsh society was deeply influenced by nonconformist religious beliefs. which emphasized the ideas of justice and fairness, which explains how the figure of Rebecca was imbued with so many symbolic influences and represented a collective resistance to the oppressed against the tyranny and injustice of the oppressor. These taxes and tolls, which I mentioned before the break, were not only crippling to the farmers, but also affecting the wider community, including laborers and craftsmen who relied on the success of the farming industry for their livelihood. The situation was exacerbated by a series of poor harvests and economic downturns, pushing many into poverty and desperation. The Rebecca Riots themselves erupted in 1839, starting in the southern west counties of Carmarthenshire, Pembrokeshire, and Cardiganshire, before spreading to other parts of rural Wales. These rioters predominantly were impoverished farmers and laborers who adopted the guise of women and invoked the persona of Rebecca as they carried out their acts of protest. The rioters generally targeted toll gates, which became symbols of oppression and exploitation. They would gather under the cover of darkness, clad in women's clothing and blackened faces, and dismantle the toll gates with axes and sledgehammers. These acts were directed against these buildings, accompanied by chants and slogans denouncing the toll gate system and the injustices perpetrated by the landowners and authorities. The first public protest occurred on the 13th of May, 1839, when the toll gate at Evergreen on the Pembrokeshire-Carmarthenshire border was demolished and its toll house set on fire. This incident followed the posting of handbills on many public doors in Evergreen, calling for a public meeting to take into consideration the propriety of the toll gates. At the meeting's conclusion, which was held, a crowd of around 400 men, some dressed in female garments and others in blackened faces, made their way to the toll gate, shouting huzzahs for free laws and free traveling to the coal pits and lime kilns, end quote. These particular gates were rebuilt and destroyed twice more. On the third attack on the 17th of July, the figure of Rebecca was recorded as appearing for the first time. Rebecca was presented as the leader, and many of her, in quotes, children were men who were covering their faces and appearance by both dressing in women's clothing and blackening their faces. The entire process of this is described, at least by some, as Rebecca would approach the gate, make a great demonstration about something stopping her way, and about her children effectively removing this problem in her way. This would be play acted amongst the various men, at least in some of the descriptions we have. That was quite a big part of the whole protest. These particular gates themselves, which I said were destroyed twice more, became a flashpoint for those who led popular protests across the country. The media coverage of the event also created a popular ideal of these protesters, making them romantic images of the unjust versus the poor and downtrodden. Of course, the protesters representing the poor and downtrodden. Eventually, the British military was called to quell the protests, but generally, throughout August and September, these riots continued, with Rebecca urging farmers to collect petitions against the landlords for rent reduction, as well as the first reports of the so-called Black Footman incidents, in which Rebeccaites demanded the support and recompense for unmarried mothers. These calls for social justice were creating a great deal of sympathy amongst the general population. Significantly, disturbances had now spread to the semi-industrialized southeast of Carmarthenshire, where farmers attacking toll gates were assisted not only by their farm laborers, but also by local mine workers who themselves were experiencing these falling wages and unemployment, as we've been mentioning, and certainly had started to focus on becoming unionized. This expression of solidarity by the industrial workers and the so-called peasants, aiming objectively at the tenant farmers, they would then hold anonymous meetings amongst these laborers to articulate their own grievances. The farmer protest might have largely been about acting through destruction, which would then lead to negotiations. But as these protests expanded, they didn't always go that way, and on occasions, these events would turn violent. That is something to keep in mind, that not everything was simple, peaceful, with negotiated protest afterwards. Over the entire life cycle of the Rebecca protests, they were largely confined between 1839 and 1844. Calls for societal reform were always a big key to the objectives of these protests. The fury was always measured by calls of political and social change. Quoting again from the Welshman, they read a list of their complaints and of the changes they desired, which included not only the removal of all turnpike gates in their country, but also the abolition of all tithes and rent charges in lieu of tithes and the alteration of the present poor law, towards which they expressed the most bitter hostility, and abolition of church rates, which an equitable adjustment of their landlord rents would also be required. These, with other alleged grievances, 6 or 7 in number, they stated their determination to get remedied." End quote. As you can imagine, this lit a fire in an era where public protests and demonstrations were creating massive problems for the government across Europe. Fear of these events would definitely drive reactions from authorities, either through military action or through straight-up assaults on these groups. Even as reactions amongst governments were increasingly more and more severe, it was apparent that not everyone was in agreement with this. As the editorial in The Welshman put it, quote, "Rebecca and her daughters were riding rampant over us, and do not confine themselves to uprooting turnpike gates and destroying toll houses, but have in Cardiganshire, we are informed, already begun to resist execution of writs of levy for a debt. Threatening letters have been sent to more than one magistrate. No reward that they have offered will draw forth the smallest evidence against them. Added to which, it cannot be disguised that the primary efforts of Rebecca were directed against certain public grievances which the state of law permitted to be carried into effect, and which the public felt could only be removed by the lawless proceedings adopted." End quote. So in other words, there was an acknowledgement that public protests seemingly was the only way to get the attention and to meet the demands of what was necessary. The tax protests covered all levels of society, but the toll gates were singled out as suitable targets for assault since they were highly visible objects, less easily defended and more easily attacked, as they were inanimate objects rather than more personal symbols of discontent, such as a workhouse, a landed estate, or indeed economic hardships of the rural economy itself. The Rebecca riots, however, were not just about economic grievance. They were also a protest against social inequality and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few. The rioters demanded reforms to improve the lives of the rural poor, including fairer taxation, better wages, and more opportunities for ordinary people to own land, something they saw as a way out of this cycle of financial hardship. The response from the authorities was swift and often brutal. The government deployed troops to quell the riots, and many rioters were arrested and imprisoned. Despite the crackdown, the Rebecca riots continued for several years, as I mentioned, spreading to other parts of Wales as they did. However, for the gentry, the danger of these riots and the targets of the protests, which they were, meant that they had different ideas on how best to react to them. Some, like Edward Crompton Lloyd Hall, heir to the Kilgwyn estate, responded to these events by holding meetings with the local population to try and understand why there was so much discontent. He would go on to appeal for redress for these people, while calling on the protesters to back away from the unlawful acts and to contain their expressions of anger through legal means. His efforts certainly were a difference from some others who appealed for more stringent enforcement from the governing authorities. especially punishing the guilty more stringently, or in some cases they would then abandon their estates in Wales for fear of being physically attacked and driven out. The Rebecca Riots were more than just a sporadic act of vandalism. They were manifestations of deep-rooted social economic grievance and a struggle for social justice and equality. The riots brought attention to the plight of the rural poor and forced the government to eventually address some of their grievances. In the aftermath of the riots, there were significant reforms aimed at addressing the issues that had sparked the unrest. The toll gate system was reformed and many toll gates were removed altogether. The government also passed legislation to regulate land enclosures and improve tenant rights, albeit with various degrees of success. Moreover, the Rebecca Riots served as a catalyst for broader social and political movements in Wales. They highlighted the power of the collective action and the grassroots mobilization which challenged entrenched power structures and forced people in power to listen to those who were the previously silent majority. The Rebecca Riots stand as a testament to the resilience and determination of the Welsh rural population in face of adversity, fueled by social economic grievance and a sense of collective injustice. The riots challenged the status quo and forced the powers that be to acknowledge the plight of the oppressed. While the Rebecca Riots may have been confined to a specific time and place in Welsh history, their legacy does endure, inspiring future generations to stand up against injustice and equality. One of the benefits of reading about these things and coming to understand them, it does kind of give in context where a lot of the changes in Welsh perspectives on labor and on the rights of the poor and those who have been disadvantaged for various reasons become much more popular as we move into the next century, and how they become a center point to some of the labor movements which are growing at this time, and how beliefs around trade unionism and movements of that ilk became so popular in Wales and have such an influence even to this day on our society, on our politics, and on our government. I think it's something that is something that people in Wales can look back at and see where this began and how important it was. I think before this, you can kind of draw a line between what was before and what was after, the understanding, much like you can from the end of the Glyndŵr period until the beginning of basically the post-Stuart era. There's kind of lines that you can draw in history, especially the history of Wales, where you can say, well, this was the before, this is the after. The independence movement and the fight for representation in the periods after the Edwardian conquest and to the ending of the Glyndŵr revolts are definitely a period of Welsh history. The next period, the Tudor period, with its aftermath of civil wars and discontent, also make another period. And then we have what I would call the 1700s and the 1800s, where you have a slightly different perspective and a different idea about Wales as a part of Britain. But as the 1800s continue, as we go into the latter half of the 1800s, we will start to see the branching out and understanding of the nation as it is in its current function, and on how movements within various parts of Wales, be it conservative, Labour, Plaid, or any number of other different things, start to begin around this time and how they're created and come about. That's one of the reasons why I looked at this particular episode as kind of a defining point for Wales and how it develops and what goes forward, because so much of what has been building in the last 16 prior episodes comes to a head at this point. All of these cycles of issues are now creating this popular protest and this popular revolt against the previous regime and previous understanding. And I think it's very important to understand, and definitely something we need to continue to consider as we go forward with the podcast. With all that said and done, thank you all for listening. I hope you have yourselves a great day. If you have any comments, questions, or concerns, you can always reach me at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. You can reach out to me on Twitter at Welsh History Pod or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. Or if you would like to help finance and assist me with the research that goes on for this podcast, you can do so through patreon.com/Welsh History. And I thank anybody who donates, no matter when they did, and no matter how much they have, because without you, certainly some of the research that I've been able to do, especially for this episode, for example, would not have been possible. Thank you all for listening. I hope you have a great day. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.
I'm Ken Harbaugh, host of Burn the Boats from Evergreen Podcasts. I interview political leaders and influencers, folks like award-winning journalist Soledad O'Brien and conservative columnist Bill Kristol, about the choices they confront when failure is not an option. I won't agree with everyone I talk to, but I respect anyone who believes in something enough to risk everything for it. Because history belongs to those willing to burn the boats. Episodes are out every other week wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello everyone, my name is Tom Kearns and I host the Anglo-Saxon England podcast, where I cover the history and culture of England from the departure of the Romans in the 5th century to the Norman conquest in 1066. So far we've surveyed the collapse of Roman rule in Britain, the migration of the Anglo-Saxons, and the history of Northumbria from its beginnings in the mists of legend to its destruction at the hands of Viking raiders in the 9th century. I hope you'll come and give it a go.